shading devices,
Yeah, okay.
and they have to understand what it is.
Yeah, of course.
Hi, good morning, everyone. In today's lecture, we have a guest, Chris Jensen. He'll speak about energy in the residential houses. So this is something that could be very helpful for the third part of your assignment, to complement your annotations of your building systems with something specific related to some specific performances. It could be from energy, acoustic, insulation, whatever we speak about today. We'll also include, just to let you know, all the guest lectures have been included in the exam questions, which was prepared yesterday. So somehow it's important that you also look at that. The slides will be available, and we'll find some very simple questions coming from the slides and the material provided. Now, I'll let Chris talk. He said he would present for about an hour, and then there is a bit of question time.
Sure. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alberto. Hi, guys. First question is, who here has done or is doing environmental building systems as a subject? Okay, so some of you. So some of this will be a bit of a refresher, but there's also, I've deliberately made it different as well. So when we start talking about, for example, insulation, you will have heard this type of stuff. Anyway, so I exist in part of the faculty that is a little bit detached from architecture and construction. It's obviously related, but what I'm really about that is a little bit different is, I guess, performance criteria and functionality. So when you do anything related to design and architecture, that's obviously one aspect of buildings. And then subjects like this, much more practical about how building actually goes together. In between those, there is this world, like I say, that is related to performance and function. So energy performance and comfort, which are the main things we'll talk about in houses, is now widely accepted as something that needs to be considered. So we have regulation for that, and we have expectations in the market for this type of performance. So it's no longer acceptable to build a house that can't maintain comfort, for example, or it doesn't have windows in a bedroom. Things like that are a requirement of houses. So I've got a couple of slides at the start, just the comics. I think capture some of the ways that we approach this stuff that is a little bit backwards. So in this example, you can see the guys searching for oil in the ground, ignoring the fact that there's this blazing nuclear reactor in the sky that we can use to do the same thing. And I mean, you would obviously connect that to solar power versus looking at burning coal and oil for generating electricity. So some of it's just a shift in perspective, and our northern hemisphere neighbours tend to be across this stuff a fair bit better than we are. I'm particularly referring to Europe, I suppose, but America and Canada as well, where they understand that there's a natural order that things should occur in, and having a terrible house with a heater blazing out heat isn't actually a good outcome. If you measured the air temperature, maybe it is 20 degrees, but it's drafty, there's radiant temperature problems, and it's actually not necessarily comfortable. So what this one's about, again, this is a slide I use generically, that they're having a summit on climate issues, and whether you believe in CO2 and greenhouse gas and all of that climate-related stuff, the question is, what if it's all a waste of time and we end up creating better houses, in my case, for nothing? And the answer is, it's still worthwhile. So even if you don't believe in this stuff, and I use this argument all the time with people who don't believe in climate change or anything to do with that, I say, so what's so bad? We end up with cars, houses, trains, planes that are higher performing, more comfortable, as a result of something that didn't necessarily exist. Whether it did or not is irrelevant. So that's one of the, I guess, part of the context for what I'm getting at. And people tend to resist change, and that's absolutely couldn't be more true in the construction industry. It's very hard to change anything. Last slide on the climate aspects. Buildings are responsible for 40% of emissions. So it's a fairly obvious target. There's in fact a I think it's the IPCC, which is the International Panel on Climate Change, produced a graph which showed the opportunity to save emissions compared to cost. And there were a couple of things that were a cost benefit and a saving. And one of them was things like weather seals, insulation, those sorts of things in a building. So overall, you get a financial benefit, and overall you reduce emissions. It was one of the few things. So globally, there is a target towards improving building performance for that reason. Okay, so what we're talking about today, we're going to kind of cut through, I guess, the whole world of energy performance in buildings, starting with how houses specifically are designed, then looking at the services we use to make up the deficit in performance, and then touching on some operations issues as well. So what are we trying to achieve? This is the hardcore sustainability aspect. I'll let you read this yourself. I have a quiet drink. Everyone read that? Good. Nearly. They don't respond when they're still reading. Okay, so what this is about is, I guess, that more holistic, deep green view, and that's not what I'm talking about today. And it is true, however, we are biological organisms and we have requirements in terms of comfort. We still exist in the world that responds to humidity, daylight cycles and things like that. And it is a driver of what we need to do in terms of designing buildings, but we mostly ignore it. So a building in America in the snow can look very much like a house that might be built in Darwin, for example. So some of those things we need to start being a bit more aware of. This, again, a bit more of the deep green approach of looking at what sustainability is. Typically, the term sustainability, I attach it mostly, as is listed there, to efficiency or the concept of less bad. So if you look at a marketing brochure for a house and you say, and it says a sustainable house, what it actually means is that it's a bit better than the average stuff that's built in the industry. So we are a fair way from the true meaning of sustainability and true levels of performance, like, for example, not using any energy, very low carbon, and things like this. Now, this is a concept I think is very important to understand when we're talking about energy in buildings. Energy for light, heat, cooling, ventilation, whatever it is, we kind of attach to this, obviously electricity in most cases, and we just assume this is something that's required, a bit like petrol in a car. It's something that we need to do. In the case of houses, what's important to understand is that we use energy for our comfort, directly for our comfort. So who can tell me a single thing that uses power in the house other than like a toaster? Heater, excellent. So that uses gas or electricity. That's right. What other sources of heat do we have in a house? How can we make a house warmer without a heater? Sorry, there's two answers in at once. Thermal mass. Okay, so the properties of the actual building itself is related to, maybe we don't need the heat because we've retained the heat that was already there, for example. Maybe there's another source of heat, and the sun's a good obvious example of that. Point being, we attach energy use in buildings to our comfort. So lights are also an example of that. We burn that little incandescent thing or the fluoro thing or the LED to have light. There is plenty of light outside. So it is our device, our design that has created this situation. We have to use energy to be comfortable. So in here, this room, we're almost completely disconnected from the environment. We rely on energy for pumping air through, so ventilation, for the temperature, so heating and cooling, certainly for lighting as well, and then the power systems as well. So this lecture theatre could exist anywhere and be this condition. It could be in Japan, could be in the heat, anywhere. We wouldn't really notice the difference. So this room is a very good example of comfort conditions. And by comfort, don't just think of temperature. Think of all of the aspects, so visual, acoustic, all of those things. Comfort is provided artificially. So what you should then see is that comfort is something that is the direct result of energy in most cases. And what I want to show you is how that doesn't have to be the case. So this is the definition of thermal comfort. And I think it's quite interesting when you talk about comfort in a bit more detail, being the reason we use energy. Just as a short segue, we could build a log, what are they called? A log house in the forest with no heating and cooling. Still be a house, still be weatherproof, but it misses the comfort elements. Then we could burn wood to be warm, but maybe we don't have light. So you can see how that connection goes. But where we have got to with comfort in buildings is that we can have every bit of comfort we want. And I think everyone knows that. Think of a plane. 30,000 feet in the sky. There's light, there's comfortable temperature, there's air, etc. So anyway, what's interesting about this when you look at thermal comfort is it's an absence of a negative feeling. So if you're comfortable in here, it's because you're not feeling hot or cold. You think it's bright enough, but it's not too glary, that sort of thing. So that's an interesting way to think of comfort when you're trying to achieve it. Now, of course, comfort is different for different people. Won't dwell on this, but depending where you come from or what the temperature was like outside today will depend on how comfortable you are. And there's a range of factors that determine comfort that I'm not going to go into right now. But it's good to understand that two people in the same house, one might turn on the air conditioner, one might not, and be comfortable. So we've got to think about that when we're trying to design buildings. So the reality is, and this is going back to our sort of biological organism nature, that we can adapt to conditions. If you go on holiday to Fiji and it's 26 degrees overnight, it's not really a big problem because you have the fan on, there's nice ventilation through windows and things like that. But that's unacceptable in our own homes in Melbourne. So we do adapt to those sorts of things. And one of the solutions, I guess, if you connect energy to being comfortable, one of the solutions is to allow for a range of comfort. And that is subject, of course, to the occupant as well. But that's very difficult in, for example, a hospital, where you can't afford to have a different comfort level. So buildings like hospitals, not surprisingly, high degree of comfort, very, very energy intensive. Probably one of the highest, along with buildings like data centres and things like that. So there are plenty of examples where we can't achieve what we need to do. As an example, that picture is the Princess Elizabeth Base Station in Antarctica, which is, I think it's a Belgium station. It has no connection to anything for power and has very little heating requirement. It's because it's very well insulated, and we know about insulation. So if a building like that can achieve that kind of performance, we obviously can do as well. So with that in mind, and still talking about comfort a little bit, we need to somehow provide a degree of comfort that we're used to without using the energy. And that's actually the difficult bit. Anyone can turn the heater off and use no gas, or turn the lights off and use less electricity. But that's not necessarily comfortable. So between design and construction to a degree, we can work to fix that connection. And above all, even if the building has been designed to be very sustainable for whatever reason, and it isn't a comfortable building, then it's still a bad building. It hasn't fulfilled its functional role to provide comfort to its occupants. So that's a really important connection, and that's where I guess the connection is. People might say that being sustainable is going back to the dark ages because you turn off the lights and the heating and you live in this sort of awkward environment where it's not comfortable, and people don't want to do that. This is just a quick slide to show, is it possible? This is an interesting one related to energy, not just residential buildings, but to look at, this is a bit old now, so I'd hope there's more, but to look at where the zero energy buildings are around the world. And it seems a bit odd to me, I think most of you will agree, that it's clustered in Europe. So what is it different about Europe that means they go for this very low energy concept? Why take Germany, easy example. They've developed a lot of this sort of stuff. Why are the Germans so energy efficient with buildings?
Densely populated cities.
Mm-hmm. And what does that mean?
So the square meter per person would be a lot less.
No, this is, okay, I understand that. Yeah, fair enough. So the energy use per metre squared per person sort of thing. These are individual buildings that are net zero, so there's a lot of them. In Germany is more the point. So my answer is that it is as simple as the mindset of the Germans is that you consume less and waste less. And that is their attitude, and they bring that into their building design, as with many other aspects of what they develop. It's very highly refined in terms of design, and that it results in a very high performance. So perhaps it's as simple as translating what they like to other countries. Okay, so from a concept perspective, these are the kind of take-home messages. So the word sustainability is a bad one to use when you're talking about energy performance of buildings. Most people refer to a sustainable or green building is less bad than another one. Building design, which in my world is this functional, performance-based activity, is still fairly dominated by the architect and the design of the building from an aesthetic perspective. So something I'd probably touch on again is I challenge all my students to achieve aesthetic design, but also achieve performance. And that's actually a harder task than just saying, here's a fantastic looking building. There's plenty of fantastic looking buildings that are terribly uncomfortable or use horrendous amounts of energy around. So we know that to be true. Then there's the comfort aspects I think we've captured. And we end up at this type of concept where we have a building that I guess is somewhat dynamic, and it deals with its environment. It will be different in different climates. It will be different for different uses. So natural ventilation, not really a good strategy for a hospital, but great for a house. So we need to try and understand the range of tools we have that allow us to achieve comfort and low energy together, and we'll go through some of those now, many of which we've discussed, like insulation and thermal mass. If we just consider for a second what it is we're trying to do, we're trying to maintain comfort inside. If we look at temperature alone, daylight's easy. It's day, it's night. Fairly straightforward, minimise glare, that sort of stuff. Temperature's pretty difficult. These are the things that are dynamic. So it's a dynamic environment. So there's the daily temperature range is one thing, the seasonal is one thing, humidity, the amount of sun might be, it's different in Melbourne to Mildura, for example. It's different in London to Spain, etc. Wind effect as well. We're relying on the wind to be our ventilation and our cooling system, and we live in an environment where there's very little wind for whatever reason. Well, that's obviously not going to work too well. So there's a lot of dynamic aspects that we have to deal with when you consider that the building environment, the internal environment, is largely static. So we want a fixed range of temperature, humidity, etc., with this external condition. I know you obviously have connected the fact that we're trying to use the best of what's available through the design of the house to create the comfort. That's the connection. So we have tools to do this, and what's the difference for the most part between working with the sun as a tool to create our low energy building versus the wind? What would be the key difference, do you think? Is one more variable than the other? Does the sun have a fairly fixed path through the sky? Fairly fixed or exactly fixed? Yes. So it's fairly easy to deal with that dynamic aspect because a large part of it is fixed. I say dynamic because there's still clouds and there's still things like that that interact with the amount of light. But for the most part, we can predict that. So it's a really good one to start with. How do we use the sun? Do we need the sun? Etc. The wind, however, we have an idea of where it typically comes from, but on a daily basis, we have no idea what's going to happen. So quite different examples of the dynamic nature of a thing. This is what I was getting to before with the example that we are trying to work with a dynamic external element to create a fairly fixed internal condition. So you should understand that the difference between the difference in the energy use that we have is exactly the difference between how well we use the outside condition to create the inside condition. So if we use it well, we don't need much heating or cooling. If we use it poorly, we have to make up all these gaps by blowing heat or cool through the house. So we end up with, from a thermal perspective, a fairly straightforward, I guess, physics-based system. And again, this is still before we've added heating and cooling or lighting. We're still talking about the design of the building. So we have heat going in and heat going out. So if you open a window in a house when it's too hot inside, it's a bit cooler outside, what's actually happening from a temperature perspective? This is an easy question, so you can answer it. Come on. Do I have to pick people in here? What happens when we open the window and it's hot inside? Thank you. It cools down. Okay, so that's a temperature thing. It's an energy flow. Heat's a type of energy. Okay? You may be interested to hear that when it's cold, what's actually happening is there's an absence of heat energy. So keep that in mind when you're thinking of energy flow. You're always talking about which way the energy is flowing. And it obviously, hot and cold flow against each other, but what you talk about is the energy flowing from hot to cold always. Okay? Now, the little green box there talks about being a balancing of active heat flow. So it's pretty common in Melbourne to be trying to reduce heat flow in during the day and reduce heat flow out during the night. And that needs different strategies or solutions to a degree. But the thing is, we already know how to do this. So we know not to stand in the sun and get baked, to go under the shade. So, I mean, how many people here have a building or a house where when it's hot you actually walk outside, not inside, and use blinds, you actually walk outside and put something down over the windows? How many people do that? Anyone? I don't even do that myself, but it makes sense. That's what you would do if you're a person. If you're a person and it's hot, you sit under a tree. It's really easy, and it's less hot. We can all do that, of course. If it's cold, the answer's already shown there. We can use the sun, let the heat in. And importantly, keep it in. So it's great that you've warmed your house up in the afternoon when the west sun streams in, but if it just gets cold again in 3 hours, that's not a comfortable condition. So you need to try and deal with that. So all of this, like I say, is balancing the energy flow of heat in this case. We talked about this, what you can do, different types of things we can do. So we have an inbuilt evaporative cooling system in our body. Sweating. Be familiar with that, I'm sure. We talk about comfort in a building. We're not trying to make the building comfortable. We're trying to make the people in the building comfortable. And people have a natural system within them. So what do we need to add into a building to take advantage of an evaporative cooling system that we naturally have? So if I'm sweating, this is painful. If I'm sweating, what could I do to cool myself down quicker other than have a bath or anything? Perfect. So we need air movement. So ventilation and air movement is really important for cooling. So fans are something that never get built into houses these days, yet pretty straightforward, good solution to have. One of the problems with this whole situation, though, when you think of heat from the sun, is light comes from the sun as well. And you can't separate heat and light. There is no easy way, when you're looking at the sun, to take one bit, not the other. There are ways of trying to do that, and shading is a good example, where you then rely on the diffuse light bouncing off other things. But ultimately we have this problem. And this is more of a commercial building problem, because they want lots of daylight into the space to reduce light energy, but no heat at all. In a house, we typically want the heat as well, so it's not such a problem. And the last thing on those aspects of what are the things we're considering is the internal loads. So depending on what's inside the building, and houses are fairly predictable obviously, it does all that heat. So you need to allow for that. This is all, how do you piece together the puzzle to create the right house? Because one apartment with 8 people in it is going to be hotter a lot more of the time than the same apartment with 1 person. And that means the strategy that you need to use to reduce energy is different. So I guess that's the key aspect of this section, that you need to understand the needs of the space to determine what's the right design. And that is quite hard early in the design stage. So there are our key tools, which we'll discuss quickly. Thermal insulation, which is the barrier to the heat flow. So if we don't want to use the heating as much, we need to keep the heat that was already there in the building. And that means not let that energy flow through the windows and walls, which is insulation. Solar radiation, straightforward, that's the sun, that's heat. Thermal mass, someone mentioned thermal mass. Who can explain to me how thermal mass works? Who was that? Who mentioned thermal mass before? Okay, can you explain how it works, even simply?
Yeah, thermal mass absorbs the heat and releases impact line.
Okay, perfect. Well done, thank you. Okay, so insulation resists heat flow from one direction to the other. If it's 26 degrees inside and 26 degrees outside, the insulation's doing nothing at all, because there's no flow of energy in any direction. Thermal mass is different though. Thermal mass is not resisting flow, it's storing heat. And like I say, it's always about storing or releasing heat, not about cold. Cold's the opposite of heat. I know you know that, but it's good to understand that. So that's another thing we can use in our system or our toolbox to create a comfortable building. Okay, I'm going to quickly go through some of these because otherwise I'm going to run out of time. Actually, let me just look at this. Yeah, okay, I'll skip a little bit further down. Okay, so I use this slide a lot too, and I think this is really important in this performance functionality component. What we have is someone who's responsible for the building fabric, whether it's the architect, the builder, whatever, the carpenter, I don't care. Someone else is responsible for the systems in the building. And then finally, what we all want from our building is comfort, okay, at the bottom. And it is as simple as those elements along there. That's what we need, that's what we want. Any of the things we do to a building makes this better or worse for our comfort in the space, okay? So light, fresh air, etc. Now, this is deliberately made very simple. And what you see is that the building envelope, the better that is, the less service we need to have the same comfort. The worse it is, the better or the more energy input we need in services to have the same comfort. So you can really very quickly say, I'm going to have a better building and use less service energy. And that is directly the case. Now, to add a little bit of complexity to it from a financial perspective, the building envelope is expensive and it's paid for obviously up front. The use of energy in services is this sort of ongoing relatively low costing. So you get a power bill every 3 months and you pay $300. It's not a big deal when building a building and its fabric costs $200,000, is it? So one of the problems we have in getting this whole thing to be fixed towards the approach that Germans have, which is very high performance buildings, amongst other people I should say, is to have a developer who pays for the building understand that there is a value in having a better quality building for the occupant who ends up using the building. Okay, so it's a really difficult problem, very specific to multi-residential buildings. Multi-residential buildings, build the whole thing by a developer, massive cost, $80 million, sell each apartment, and then each apartment owner pays the bill ongoingly. So why does the developer bother putting extra insulation in? There's no value to him because he doesn't pay the bills. So there's a few scenarios where this is the real problem. Conversely, there's a few where it works really well. So university builds the building but also pays for the bills. So they understand that if we build a slightly better building, we can use less power in an ongoing way. So that's quite an important one to understand that I imagine is not too difficult to understand. Okay, I'm going to skip this bit. Skip to there. Okay, so with all of those concepts, I guess, in mind and how we have to try and balance all these things to do with climate and occupants and building design and all that sort of stuff, what we end up with is the current day issue. So this is based on real houses in Victoria. And you can see where the power is used. So heating and cooling and hot water are nearly 3/4 of our energy use in Victoria. So we have a heating and a hot water dominant energy situation for houses in Victoria. Now, you know straight away that there's things like solar hot water that nearly eliminate that amount, that 28%. The rest, heating and cooling, is a combination of the quality of the heating and cooling system, but as you know, importantly, the building itself. So if the builder does a poor job of installing insulation or specifies the wrong windows or seals doors badly, that becomes a problem. If the architect's done a poor job of designing it, all the windows face south, that sort of thing, there's no thermal mass, that's a problem too. And then of course the quality of the product. So it needs to be tackled in a few different ways. Lighting's not really a big issue in houses, it's more of a commercial building thing. So if we look at our solutions now, we obviously need to try and keep the heat in. We talked about that, and that's the picture of the esky there. That bottom picture is a thermal infrared camera picture. Who can tell me what's going on in that picture there? This is a bit of a difficult one, I have to admit.
Thermal bridging.
What you're looking at is the ceiling of a room. It's actually my parents' house, believe it or not. In the yellow portion up here, that's where there's insulation. So the camera is seeing that the plasterboard is warmer where there's insulation above it. So it's warmer inside than outside in this situation, okay? So the heat's rising, it's getting to the plasterboard here, and it's staying warm because there's insulation above. So where's the insulation missing then? Okay, where it's purple. So over here, they're the roof rafters going across there, supporting the ceiling. There's no insulation in that top purple section. So what the camera sees is that the plaster is colder because the heat's just leaking straight through. So it's fairly well proven that this sort of stuff is a problem. And what's nice about this, if you've got a little bit of a physics mind or a mathematical mind, is that it's very linear. So heat loss is very linear through fabric, so it's actually very easy to calculate. The problem is the dynamic nature of the external environment and the internal environment. That's more of a problem. I'm going to have to skip through some of these too. This is what I want to do. So there's a whole bunch of stuff about R values, and R value is the measure of how well insulation can resist heat. So that's what R stands for, resistivity. So higher R value, less heat flows through. And that's a property specifically of insulation. So concrete seems to keep coming up. It's very thick, it's very heavy, it must have a good R value. It's fairly poor overall. They're one of those slides, and you can look at those slides and get an understanding of this stuff later. One of those slides shows that 150 mil of concrete, which is what, that thick, has the same R value of 20 mil of plaster or 6 millimetres of polystyrene. So concrete's actually pretty poor. Thermal mass, very different story. It's excellent. This is an example here of what extent some people go to insulate their house, and this is a standard called Passive House. You can see it there. Useful one to look up if you're interested in, I guess, the extreme end of insulating houses. And you can see all the yellow and some of the white stuff is insulation, and you create a continuous thermal envelope around the whole building. This is a project I worked on a little while ago where the walls are in fact two separate walls with insulation so thick, it was about 300 mil thick. Even to the point where you can see here it was deliberately designed so that one part of the wall insulation would continue down so that the floor structure never contacted the outside. Because as you saw in that thermal infrared picture, where the joists are is where there's actually a lot of leakage through. And someone mentioned thermal bridges before, which we'll talk about. Just random insulation pictures. This is what I'm referring to here. So double stud wall. So try and walk onto a site or talk to a client who's building their dream house and say, I'm going to more than double the thickness of your walls at increased cost, reduced floor area, added labour and all of that aspect to it. And they say, why are we doing this? And you'll say, oh, you'll pay $200 for heating instead of $300. So that is literally the problem that drives the fact that people don't tend to do this sort of construction. So polystyrene has taken off massively for buildings. Why? Very good insulation, relatively straightforward to build with, fairly easy to build with. There's a whole world of problems related mostly to water, waterproofing and all sorts of aspects like that. But you'll see a lot of this in construction now. Do you talk about this type of cladding? Not really. Okay, so a lot of houses will have this type of construction perhaps on the upper floor and brick veneer on the lower floor or something like that. So it just screws directly onto the frame, which is what you can see. That's what all those plugs are in the top picture there. Screw going through, and then joint sealed, and then this fiberglass webbing is sort of half glued over the foam, and then render. So if you had a sledgehammer and you hit the wall, it goes straight through it, which is one of the reasons people don't tend to like it as much. But you can see the pictures there. It's used for pretty high-end houses as well. Oh, okay, we've seen that one. Okay, this is another example of a thermal infrared, just showing this is still heat flow. What do you think is the difference between those two windows? This is my house now. Damn you, yes, it is. So the one that's double glazed, it effectively, it looks like it's got a blind down, or it looks like it's got some sort of insulating coating, and it's exactly what's going on. The other one's, of course, just leaking heat out. Okay, so glazing becomes a big part of this. The heat loss out of glass is a massive problem. What's the other aspect about glass that's very unique? What does glass do related to heat gain? Lets the sun in, yeah. So glass has got this kind of evil, good versus evil twin thing happening. Terrible heat loss in most cases, but we need it. We need daylight, we need heat, we need the other architectural and comfort aspects that a window provides, like views. So it is bad, but, oh, there you go, this explains it. So most of the heat in a building will come through the windows. That's because of radiation, so direct sunlight. And half of it is lost. So it's a massive part of buildings. And what do we like to build buildings out of these days as much as possible? What are the coolest houses and the biggest buildings all made of? What? Concrete? I'd say glass. Glass is cooler in a house. You see, think of an apartment. There are apartments where every part of the external walls is glass. So here we have this situation. So you can see there a direct problem between architectural design and performance is the windows, and that's 100% true, both academically and in the industry. Okay, I'm going to skip this stuff too because we've got to run out. Okay, so we'll go down to thermal mass. So glass has particular properties: very high heat transfer in and out, and also radiant heat from the sun gain. So it's quite a complex thing to have to deal with. Thermal mass, very important. Typically concrete is used, but there are other elements like water that store temperature. So if you're in a high thermal mass building, it won't vary in temperature much, and you would have experienced that going into an old hall or a church or something like that, a heavyweight building with no insulation. It's usually always cold. It stays cold because it cools down at night, stays cold during the day, and it's freezing in winter. So you might say, well, thermal mass doesn't sound that great. But what if we put a layer of insulation over the outside of a church, for example? Maybe glue polystyrene over the church. What would the scenario be then? That thermal mass would stay more like the temperature of inside, wouldn't it? Because it's touching the air inside, it's not cooling down from outside. You might then say, okay, well, isn't that going to get too hot? And the answer then is, well, okay, now what we've fixed the heat loss problem, we're storing heat, and sometimes it's too hot, yes. So what do we do? What do you do when a house is too hot? We covered this earlier. Open a window. So you have to mix all these things together to make that church work. But thermal mass is a big part of it. You've no doubt seen that type of graph, so I won't go over that again, except to say the outside temperature fluctuates. The more thermal mass you have, the more stable the temperature is going to be. If I put, say, a brick, something heavier, a cubic metre of concrete, so a pad footing, I'm sure we talked about pad footings, cubic metre of concrete, sit it outside, say on the concrete lawn at Albanyini, what temperature is it going to be? Sorry. What temperature is that concrete going to sit at? Could we predict it? It's going to sit at the average temperature of the outside air. So it will average that temperature. And what you're seeing there is the thicker dotted line, the hollow one, is the average of the fluctuating outside temperature. So it's storing heat and releasing it to stabilise the temperature. And there's that example of how you would use it. So in winter, you let the sun onto the mass and heat it up and use that at night. And in summer, you keep it off, the sun off the mass, and at night you cool the mass down for the next day. So it's pretty simple. When you think of storage, mass, resisting flow, insulation. There are main things, and that's that example there. I'm going to skip that. Here's some examples of thermal mass. So something like that is trying to average the conditions. Obviously the openings are a bigger effect. That car park underneath the south lawn is very, very stable in temperature, very high surface area of thermal mass. And this example here, this is the labyrinth at Fed Square. So we can actually use this in our designs to not just have a block, well, a slab floor, but we can actually have a system that's made of concrete and blow air through it to cool it down or heat it up. So that's called active mass, where you actually exploit the properties of the thermal mass to be beneficial. Has anyone heard of the thermal labyrinth at Fed Square? Google it. It's really cool. You wouldn't have known it was there. It was built, about 2000 it was built, and it's very effective at providing a cool air supply to the atrium, which is open to the outside. So you couldn't put cooling into that space because you'd be using power to cool what is a partially open space. So that system sort of works for free. Afraid my pictures have gone a bit crazy there. Okay, another aspect, still looking at heat flow, is thermal bridging. So different materials conduct at different rates. Insulation is obviously fantastic at resisting heat. What's a really good conductor of heat? Metal. Yes, very good. We don't use metal spoons stirring our pot, do we? We use wooden spoons, because wooden spoons don't transfer heat. Metal spoons would transfer heat. We don't have metal coffee cups, because you burn your hand. We have polystyrene coffee cups, because it insulates, that sort of thing. So one of the things we have to do is deal with the problems in the fabric where there's a joint that conducts a lot of heat, like an aluminium window frame, like a concrete balcony projecting out of the building. So if you think of multi-residential high-rise again, you build the slab and the balcony is one piece, and then you put in your facades, and what do you end up with? This massive heat sink sticking out the side of the building, cooling down the slab on the inside. And guess who's come up with a system that separates the outer piece of concrete from the inner piece? And the thermal images capture that. So the framing here, windows losing heat, framing not so bad, but still a bit of heat transfer, insulated wall, pretty good. I might have to skip down some of these too. Okay, I'll show you some pictures. That'll be nice. Okay, so we talked about having to deal with different climates, and we can, for the most part, say that a typical house has one person per 50 metres squared and appliance density of whatever, so it's not greatly different in houses. So we're really designing for the outside climate in most cases. So this is what I've written there, tropical, but it's actually Darwin, which is Darwin? I don't know. I don't know if Darwin's technically tropical. Kind of is. What strikes you about this house with regards to the designing ideas that we've discussed? If you were to describe this house to someone in one word, what word would you use from a performance-y style perspective? Maybe light or airy, something like that? Okay. Yeah, okay, yeah, very much so. So the emphasis being on airflow, you tend not to have thermal mass in this kind of environment because you're just keeping heat that you don't really want. You're also acknowledging that it's hot all the time. So you're not likely to kind of shut down the building and try and have a different internal condition to outside. You're more likely to say it's really hot all the time. I don't want complete openings because of the mosquitoes, but I want air flowing around as much as possible. I don't want any connection to the ground or as much as possible. So you have this really light design that allows air. The other thing, of course, that would strike you about that is the fairly well shaded nature of it. So keep the sun off. You can see in some elements of that, the roof's actually lifted away. So there's another element of airflow underneath the roof from the building. Arid, I classified my own 4 climates to show you. There's obviously others. But arid's really interesting, and you could describe it. The easiest thing for me to say is Mildura, if you know this area well, because very sunny, very hot during the day, very cold during the night. So what strategies are going to work in that climate, do you think? Yeah, thermal mass. So store the heat during the day, keeping the building cool, and release it at night so it's not so cold overnight. Exactly right. You'd have to have insulation as well. You also have to have some interaction in terms of ventilation, but maybe not as much as that Darwin example. This has this particular building, which is not a house, it's actually an eco-centre, has this interesting system which is a rock bed to act as thermal mass. And you could pass air through it to cool it down and heat it up. Why would you have a rock bed? What's the difference between a rock bed and thermal concrete? What's the actual difference between a whole pile of rocks and one solid thing of concrete? What? Yeah, okay, surface area. So more air gets across all of the rocks and cools them or heats them more effectively. Temperatte's really difficult. So temperate in my head is Sydney. You have a bit of everything. It's mostly comfortable, but you do have to deal with hot and you do have to deal with cold. So what would your solution be to that climate where it's mostly comfortable, but you've got to deal with some extremes from time to time? What's a good solution there? How about someone from that side of the room? Any ideas? Yeah?
Mixture of all things.
Yeah, adaptability. That's exactly right. And that's exactly what you have to do. All of this, please keeping in your mind that you're creating a system that uses the outside condition instead of just saying, I'm going to ignore what's outside, I'm going to turn on the lights, heating or cooling. That's your whole objective. And the cold example is mostly keep heat in and get sun in as well. So that image is in fact the passive house standard image, and the thing to note about it is the continuity of the insulation around the outside of the building, with the windows being punctuated through that, of course. It's got other systems which are interesting. I'm going to skip through this a little bit as well. Okay, so from a design perspective, we tend to design by specifically ignoring the outside conditions with our systems. The problem is it doesn't really work like that, and a house can be very cold when you arrive home at night because the heater hasn't been on. It would be much better if it maintained its own temperature. Heating and cooling mixes in different places, and you need different combinations of solutions. That's why, again, I'll challenge you guys, whatever degree you end up doing or wherever you're at in your degree, is to say it's actually a challenge to get this part of it right because it's so dynamic. It's a little bit like designing a car for a person, not knowing how fast they're going to drive, where they're going to drive. Is it on sand? Is it on a Formula One track? All those things, and you say, well, I've got to try and match the needs of this person to the perfect design of car. It is a little bit like that. Okay, so you're happy for me to go a bit longer, aren't you?
But maybe, I don't know, you want to have 5
5
minutes break? Or you just want to go more 10, 15 minutes?
I'll just go for another 10 or 15, I think, if everyone's happy.
Okay.
So we spent that entire time talking about the building and how to make the building do all the work. And that is the key to the right outcome. Make the building do the work for the comfort conditions. Not, again, I stress, we're not trying to make a building reduce energy. We're trying to make a building be comfortable so we don't use energy. That's the difference. So from a services, we're talking about anything that uses power to create comfort, basically, and that's pretty straightforward. As we've discussed, providing comfort by just blasting hot air into a room is easier than spending the time putting insulation in and getting all of that right. We've got the problem of the capital cost of a building versus the operating cost of services. That's a big issue. And we have to acknowledge that there are times where we can't avoid services. I mean, I'm not that die-hard. So lights at night, unavoidable. There's not a building, well, there's very few buildings that don't have lights for the night time, so that's a big problem. This is a short thing to say. With downlights, this is a house-specific thing, and this is changing now. so I have to update this, but we use halogen downlights to light a house. So from a physics perspective, what we've actually got is 30 tiny little heaters in the ceiling that also happen to emit light, and that's true. If you think of a halogen downlight, do you know how much of its energy used goes into heat? Who can guess? Come on, guess. Just guess. Any number. 60, 95% of the electricity in a downlight is heat. So 5% is light. So it's a little bit like, you can imagine all those examples. But that's changing, so LEDs are making a big difference. But because there's so much heat, anyone want to know what a temperature is of downlight while it's running? Another random guess from someone? Blue computer up the back. Temperature of a downlight. I'll give you a hint, it's hot. 150 degrees. So a lot of the problems with downlights are causing fires. Just as a side story, because it's industry related, you'll no doubt know of the story about the downlights. Sorry, people dying installing insulation, yeah? Is that something that you guys have heard of? There was a whole thing about 5 years ago where there was a government scheme to put insulation in roofs, and people died in doing that. So the outcome of that is that insulation got a really bad name, and old ladies would ring up and say, I want someone to take the insulation out of my roof because it's dangerous. What was actually happening is they were stapling the insulation in and got electrocuted on the downlights. So what I'm trying to get at is, I guess, how you can't always believe the way things are portrayed, particularly with related to thermal performance. So the other one that's a big one is that well-sealed buildings, which is something that's very popular now, are a problem because of mould, and they're bad for your health, and they grow all that nasty stuff. So we've got to try and see where there's a problem, chase back through the chain. What's actually causing it? What's causing that house to have a mould problem is a lack of ventilation. It's not the insulation, it's not being well sealed. We don't drive our cars around with the windows that far down all year because of the condensation we get for 3 weeks in winter. That'd be crazy. So why is that something that we do in housing? Do you understand what I'm talking about? If you understand, there's a chance that I'll understand. Okay, hot water, fairly straightforward. Solar, big thing, and you can see there the benefit of that type of system. I don't think we need to talk about hot water too much because I think it's fairly straightforward. There's different types. So the instantaneous units, the box on the wall that just heats water as it passes through, and the storage system. Then the solar systems that sit on the roof. So there's a tank at the back, and the water's heated in the panels, and it's ready for the next day. So in our climate, where we've got lots of sun, solar hot water is a bit of a no-brainer, to be honest. It can be remote coupled, that's what that's showing, and it can also have an instantaneous booster, which is what that's showing. There's newer types of solar, which are these evacuated tubes, which are quite interesting. They're tubes that have an element through them and water passes through to be heated. And there's, as an example of an installation on Paran Pool. So you see more of these types of tubes, and they're more effective in certain circumstances. Solar, you're pretty familiar with. Tends not to be on the building, despite that being quite popular. Usually installed as a secondary layer on the roof. So solar hot water is a must-have, basically, and solar electricity is now getting cheaper and cheaper. So solar is really interesting in electricity because we talked about having an air conditioner running and using power to provide comfort, and that being bad because we had a cheap building. What's wrong with having a cheap building, an air conditioner that runs off solar panels? Is there anything wrong with that? Isn't that achieving the right thing? Well, I'll leave that for you guys to ask. Will you get the same comfort overall from an air conditioner that runs in certain conditions from solar panels compared to a building that maintains its own conditions. That's really the difference there. Okay, I think I'm approaching the end. Let me see what else I've got here. Yeah, okay. I'll whip through these things because we're 2 minutes from finishing, guys. So in operation, this is not specifically to houses, but you have to think about the fact that buildings don't use energy, people do, okay? We talked about that for comfort. So it's our responsibility, and in this case it shows facility managers in a bigger building is a massive part of the role of how much energy is used by a building. None of these people are involved in the design in most cases except the owner. So the owner's in a big building unlikely to be in it all the time. Something to consider. I'll skip that. I'll skip that. So things you can do. This is more, basic solutions. Educating clients about this stuff would be what I'd say is your role. So you're not going to be in a decision-making position for a while, but if you raise your hand and say, "Why aren't you putting solar hot water on this house?" or "Make sure the insulation is installed correctly," that's your role, I think, to start with. Getting people to change their habits is obviously a big one. So using a ceiling fan instead of turning on the aircon, that's fairly straightforward. Materials probably not so specific to you guys, but there's an order of preference, and that is a nice simple way of looking at it, I think. So choosing materials from those that category in that order is a very good idea. And I don't think I have that. Sorry, I cut the slides out of there, so there's no further slides, and that means I'm finished. So thank you. Is there any questions on that stuff? I know it's a little bit to the side of what you've been looking at mostly.
Also, I have questions related to maybe your own case studies or things you've seen in connections or installation services. Maybe Chris would be happy to answer to that.
You guys are working on a 2-story house? Is that right?
Yeah.
What do you do to these guys? Do you give them like electric shock therapy or something?
Yeah. But they like to listen. That's what I understood.
Oh, good. Okay. So 2-story house. Someone tell me how a 2-story house complicates this whole situation. Yeah, perfectly. So, seeing you came up with the exactly correct issue, how might you deal with that problem? Okay? Or vent it out, or have thermal mass in a particular location. So they're the types of things that you need to do in considering any shape or size building, that's right.
Any other questions? No?
Well, that was good.
Well, it was clear.
All right.
Okay, thank you very much.
Cheers, guys.
Thank you.
See you again.